spooky soulmates. We are actually trying to do something different today. We know that we are a giggly bunch, and although we discuss creepy topics, we do it very lightheartedly. But tonight, we want to scare you.
We want an ASMR episode. Or as Rachel would put it, an MSR episode.
We're going to be very serious.
This is a test of our abilities
during this episode. And we are going to be reading scary stories. We're going to skip all of the normal intro stuff and just kind of dive right into it. So if you want to be scared and spooked, tonight is your night.
Hopefully.
Fingers crossed. We're going to just jump into these stories. They are not true stories that we know of, but they are
very well written.
Very, very well written. And they gave us goosebumps, and we definitely think they're going to give you goosebumps. So without any further ado, get ready, because we're going to jump into it with Kayla's first story.
I did not take into account that this is on Reddit, so the names are going to be ridiculous, but
we're also reading these in the dark to try and get our head in the right space.
Rachel was like, let's cut off all the lights. And I was like, okay, because I have a headache, so that works really well.
So weird, because after this, we're going to do a Ouija board. So no, we are not. Crazy. I'm going to write. I'm going to make one.
We're laughing.
Okay, Kayla.
This is by Pippinacious. And I found it on the No Sleep Reddit. It's called Fran and Jock. I was the last in a long line of grandkids on both sides of the family. No one has ever said as much, but I'm pretty sure I was an oops baby, the result of one too many glasses of wine and a couple over 40 who thought unplanned pregnancies were for teens. Oops. By the time I came along, both of my grandmothers had already passed away, and my grandfathers were elderly and lived in different states. Trying to coordinate travel plans for a family of 5, including an infant, was difficult on a budget, and neither of my grandpas were up to frequent trips. So visits were rare and spaced out over long periods. Still, both of my parents wanted me to have a relationship with them, so we'd trade phone calls so they could hear my nonsensical baby babble. They'd write me letters for Mom and Dad to read me, and they'd get crayon scribbles in return. When I was 3, they both started to experience declines in health. First my maternal grandpa, then my paternal one. Fearing the worst, Mom purchased a pair of teddy bears, the kind that had recorders in them so you could record a message that would play when the bear was hugged, and made sure to get a message saved from both. My mom's father died when I was 4. A few days after his funeral, I was given a white teddy bear with bright blue eyes that twinkled from beneath a plaid flat cap and a green sweater. When I gave it a squeeze, I heard my grandpa's slightly muffled voice from its stomach. I love you, Sadie. 2 years later, after Dad's father passed, I got the other one. It was a slate gray color, and the stitching on his face gave him a rather serious expression for a stuffed animal. A pair of red suspenders held up his tan trousers. I fell asleep hugging it, and my dad told me some years later, with tears in his eyes, that randomly throughout the night, he kept hearing Grandpop's voice coming from my room. I love you, Sadie. I named my white bear Fran and my gray bear Jock, and I put them on a shelf above my bed where they sat throughout my childhood. Honestly, I didn't give them much thought. They had become fixtures of my room, the same way the lamp and dresser were. Every now and again I'd come home from school to find one of my parents standing beside my bed, looking up at the bears or giving them a little squeeze. Even as time passed, they still recited their single phrase without fail. Aside from those instances, though, Fran and Jock were little more than dust collectors from my childhood. When I went away to college, the two didn't make the cut and were left behind while I made my way out into the world for the first time. I think my parents were a little disappointed that I wasn't more sentimental over the teddies, but any memories I had of my grandpas were hazy at best, and I didn't have the same emotional connection that they did. When Mom gently asked about whether I would like them when I moved into my first apartment, I told her no, that they were probably better off with her. Okay, she said. Well, they'll be here if you change your mind. I was pretty confident I wouldn't. The next time I went back to my parents' place was to house sit while Dad took Mom on their long-awaited vacation out west. He'd been promising her they'd go for over 30 years, and they were both buzzing with excitement. In typical Mom fashion, however, she was also very nervous. You remember where all the financial documents are in case anything happens to us, right? She asked from the back seat at least 6 times on the drive to the airport. Yes, in the white bin under your bed. And the wills? Fireproof lockbox in the back of your closet. And I think she's got it, hun, Dad said, reaching back to give her knee a squeeze. Mom harumphed and sat back. Just call if you need anything. I'll be fine, don't worry, you're only going for a week. A lot can happen in a week, she said. I grinned at her in the rearview mirror, unconcerned, and she made a face at me, but seemed to relax. After I dropped them off, I drove back to their place and started to make myself at home again. I tossed my suitcase on my bed and went to the kitchen to make some dinner and catch up on one of my shows. It had been a while since I'd had a true, completely free week all to myself, and I planned to take full advantage of it. After I ate, I kicked up my feet, stretched out, and commenced lazy lump mode. I managed to get almost 3 episodes in before I started to nod off. I checked the clock over the TV and sighed. It was only just after 11. Was I really turning into an old, early-to-bed woman already? The horror! I rolled off the couch and shut off the TV and all the lights, plunging the house into a deep darkness. Even in the inky black, I didn't feel even a twinge of nervousness. I'd grown up in the house. I knew it like the back of my hand, and all of its creaks and groans were almost comforting. I made my way to my room and flipped on the light. It had been at least 5 years since I lived there, but my parents hadn't done much to change my room except store a few bits and bobs in the closet. They said it was so I'd know I always had a place with them. I thought it was because changing it would make the fact that I was out for good more real. Whatever the reason, I appreciated the familiarity. As I started to unpack my bag, my eye was drawn to the shelf over my bed. Fran and Jock, ever vigilant, were sitting in the same spots they'd occupied for most of my life. I don't know why, but I couldn't help but smile and reach out to them. I took Fran down first and gave his little cap a tweak before squeezing him around his stomach. "I love you, Sadie," Grandpa said. After putting Fran back, I did the same to Jock, who stared up at me with his usual sternness even as I plucked one red suspender. "I love you, Sadie," Grandpop said. It was the first time I'd listened to them in a while. Even if they didn't resonate as deeply with me as they did my parents, I was glad to find their recording still worked. A quick trip to the bathroom and a change into my PJs later, I was in bed and fast falling asleep. I can't say what exactly woke me. A nightmare, I figured, given that my heart was beating quite quickly, but I couldn't remember any details. I took a deep breath and rolled over, already falling half asleep again, and found myself face to face with a dark figure on the pillow beside me. I yelped and sat up, grabbing at my phone, my nearest source of light, and shined it towards my bed. Fran was lying on his side beside me. I let out a small chuckle and gave myself a little shake to dismiss the lingering fright that he'd caused and picked him up. "Did you fall off the shelf?" I asked him quietly. I must have put him back too close to the edge earlier and gravity had done its duty. I gave Fran a gentle squeeze.
"Get out."
I stared down at the bear and blinked once, very slowly. I must be more sleepy than I realized, I thought. I was hearing things. To prove to myself that it had just been my imagination, I squeezed him again.
"Get out."
It was still Grandpa's voice, but instead of the soft warmth it had always had, it sounded cold, almost menacing. I threw Fran across the room where he hit the wall. From over my head, I heard Grandpa's more gravelly voice.
"Get out."
I whipped around and looked up at Jock. He was sitting in the same place as always, but now he was turned towards the door instead of facing forwards. Had I put him down like that? I couldn't remember.
"Get out."
Grandpa's voice came from Fran again, louder this time.
"Get out."
Grandpop echoed from Jock. The two went back and forth, their voices getting louder and louder until I slapped my hands over my ears and leapt from my bed. I wanted to scream, but my voice was stuck behind my fear-tangled tongue. I stumbled across my dark room, chased by my long-dead grandfather's voices.
"I know you're down there."
Jock shouted with Grandpop's voice. I froze. Down there? Down under the shelf? I glanced over my shoulder at the gray bear staring silently down from over my bed. I had to get out of my room. I had to get out of the house. I yanked open my door.
"I see you."
Fran said in Grandpa's voice. I was halfway out into the hall, tears streaming down my face. I didn't know what was happening. Was I going crazy? Was I dreaming? All I knew was that my 2 childhood toys were screaming threats at me, and I had to get away from them. I turned toward the stairs.
"You take one more step, I'll make sure it's your last."
Jock bellowed.
"Get out."
Fran roared. From somewhere downstairs, a step creaked. Someone else was in the house. They weren't yelling at me at all, I realized with a very strange mix of confusing relief and newly formed horror. They were yelling at the intruder who was making their way up the stairs towards me.
"Get out."
My grandfathers howled together. Footsteps clamored across the wood floor downstairs. Something fell over in the living room with a loud crash and again in the kitchen before the back door slammed against the counter as it was thrown open and a car engine rumbled to life. Somehow I regained my wits enough to run to my parents' room and look out the windows to the driveway below. An SUV was peeling backwards out into the street. It slammed into the neighbor's mailbox, righted itself, and then screeched off into the night. A heavy quiet had fallen over the house again. After waiting a few long, tense minutes, I crept back across the hall and peeked into my room. Fran and Jock were where I'd left them both, completely silent. When they stayed that way, I hesitantly approached Fran, who was lying on his stomach with his little flat cap beside him. I picked him up and with trembling fingers squeezed his stomach. "I love you, Sadie," Grandpa said warmly. I put his cap back on his head and gently put him back on the shelf beside Jock and backed out of the room, watching them the whole time with wide eyes. As I rounded the corner, headed downstairs to the phone, I heard Grandpop's voice trailing after me. I love you, Sadie. The police arrived a bit later, following my frantic call to 911. I filed a report, leaving out the bit about my talking bears, and allowed them to collect whatever evidence they could. Every so often I found myself glancing at the stairs, almost like I was expecting a repeat of whatever had just happened. It never came, and the cops wrapped it up, leaving me alone again. When I called my parents to tell them about the break-in, they immediately wanted to rush home, but I assured them there was no need. Really, I said, I don't think I have anything to worry about. We could be on the next plane, Mom insisted. No, I'm okay. Whoever that guy was, I'm pretty sure he won't be back. It took a few more go-arounds, but I eventually convinced them I was safe. And I felt it too, for the most part. After the initial shock had worn off and I'd had the time to process what had happened, I really was okay. I couldn't explain it, I couldn't tell anyone what had happened without sounding crazy, but I knew it had been real, and I knew as long as I had Fran and Jock sitting on the shelf above my bed, I could sleep easy. A few days later, the cops did find the guy who broke in. He was a co-worker of my dad's who'd overheard he'd be out of town. He thought the house would be empty and easy pickings. When he tried to tell them about the two crazy guys upstairs and their violent threats, they rolled their eyes and laughed at him. He was very surprised to hear that only a 22-year-old woman had been in the house during his botched burglary. When I returned home to my apartment a week later, Fran and Jock were with me. I keep them on the TV stand in the living room now, where they have a full view of the front door. Whenever I start to feel a bit anxious about being alone, I'll give each bear a little squeeze and smile as they speak. I love you, Sadie, and now I respond, I love you both too.
I have so many chills right now.
You jumped out of your seat.
I knew that the bears were going to be talking and saying different things at the end, but I wasn't prepared for it.
It freaked me out when I first read it. It was so
really
good.
Okay. My first story is called The Crawl Space by Madame Macabre. Hi there. I guess you could say I'm writing this as a cautionary tale to those who plan on studying abroad in future. I don't mean to discourage you from going in the first place. It's more like I just want you to be aware of this so that something like this doesn't happen to you too. I guess I should explain a little bit. Last summer, I was selected to participate in the study abroad program that would be centered in Rome for several months. Like anyone would be, I was elated. I had never been out of the States before, so this was going to be a real adventure for me. In the weeks that followed, I happily packed anything and everything I could fit into my suitcase. I will be the first to admit that I had way overpacked for this trip. I was nervous about leaving my parents for the first time, but I was also excited for the newfound freedom I would have while in Europe. Before I knew it, my parents were dropping me off at the airport, and I was boarding a 19-hour flight to Rome. Despite being long and tedious, the flight wasn't all that bad. When I exited the airport, I was greeted by the program supervisor and several other students who would be studying with me. They were about the same age, and all looked just as excited as me. From there, we went to our mandatory orientation meeting, and afterwards we went to pick up our apartment keys. In the months that preceded the trip, we were responsible for getting to know our would-be roommates, as well as finding a place to stay that we could all afford. There were 3 girls I would be staying with. They were all nice enough and made an effort to make me feel welcome, though I will admit it was hard to get close to the group of preformed friends. But despite my slight alienation, it seemed all things were going to work out well. All of us were on a similar budget plan, and by that I mean none of us really had much money to spend. Because of this, we were all on the same page while searching for the cheapest apartment we could find. After several days of searching, we stumbled across an ad for an ancient apartment located above the Campo di Fiori. That was a prime location, and we couldn't believe that it was still available, no less listed for an unbelievably low price. This immediately sent alarm bells off in my head. The place was enormous, yet the rent was cheaper than much smaller apartments in a far less desirable part of town. However, reason never really wins out in a group of excited young women. They had already made up their minds, and if I would be staying with them, this was my only option. We each received our own set of keys, as well as a map with walking directions. Because of its prime location, it really didn't take us long to get there. The Campo was amazing. During the daytime, it was filled with a vibrant market, while during the evening, it was lined with lively street performers. All of the apartments surrounding it looked to be ancient, so ours really didn't stand out all that much. After circling the square 3 or 4 times, we finally noticed the number nailed to the front of a massive old wooden door. This would be our home for the next 3 months. I fought with my keys for a moment until there was an audible click of the heavy old lock. The thick old door swung forward with a screech. There we were then met with a long winding staircase. We all looked at one another and groaned. none of us had accounted for the fact that the building had been constructed before elevators were common. So 3 sets of stairs and countless complaints later, all 4 of us, with luggage in hand, stood outside of our new front door. Once again, I reached for my set of keys and fought with a stubborn lock. As soon as the front door was opened, there was a stampede of young women trying to claim the best rooms. Being a 3-bedroom apartment, it meant that 2 of us would have to share. I personally didn't really care, so I let the others battle it out. When the dust had settled, I found that I would be sharing a room with a girl called Stephanie. This was fine with me. Stephanie was nice enough, and she was also very quiet, my ideal feature in a roommate. Over the course of the rest of the day, we ran around exploring our new home. There were 2 bathrooms, a full kitchen, and a living room with an ancient TV. Once again, I began to feel uneasy. Just how was it that we were able to get all of this for such a low price? But before I could finish that thought, I was interrupted by a fit of loud squealing. My initial reaction was panic. However, I soon learned that the noise was from excitement. Down at the other end of the apartment, near the front door, apparently there was another part of the flat that we had missed. I followed the noise until it led me to a long, dark hallway. There at the end, behind the group of squealing women, was a washing and drying machine. For those of you thinking, what's the big deal? I should explain that these things are incredibly rare in Rome. Generally, exchange students have to wash their clothes by hand in the sink before hanging them up to dry. What was a luxury item like this doing in such a cheap apartment? Just as the screaming quelled, it picked right back up again as the girls noticed a door adjacent to the washing machine. Behind the door was a master bathroom. It had a balcony, a clawfoot tub, and even a bidet. The girls immediately started fighting over whose bathroom this was going to be. I didn't really see why we couldn't share, but apparently the others were dead set on having ownership. As it turned out, it ended up being my bathroom. Stephanie had made a logical argument because she and I had to share a bedroom, while the other 2 each got their own. It was only fair that she and I got to share the master bath. And I'll admit that at first I was actually kind of excited. It was, after all, a really nice room. However, over the course of the next several weeks, I began to grow more and more wary of the room. I don't know how to put it into words. It's like every time I went into that room, I could feel something's eyes on me. And the voyeuristic element wasn't really what had me so unnerved. It felt like whatever was watching me was angry, that it didn't want me there, and that it wanted to hurt me. I began doing everything in my power to avoid the room. I asked Alicia if she would mind if I were to use her restroom occasionally. I made up a lame excuse about how it was more convenient since her room was so close while my bathroom was at the other end of the flat at the end of the very long hallway. She happily agreed, though, when I told her that she could use my bathroom anytime she liked. This worked out for a while. For about the first 2 months of my trip, I was able to completely avoid the eerie room. It wasn't until the final month that everything began to unravel. One night, as I was prepared to brush my teeth, I found that Alicia was already occupying her bathroom. I could hear giggles coming from down the hallway, and it was clear that both Stephanie and our other roommate were both getting ready for bed in the master bath. I decided that since there was strength in numbers, it would be all right just for tonight. So I made my way down to the large bathroom where I joined the boisterous girls in brushing my teeth. They were in the midst of some conversation when Lindsay, our other roommate, had broken into such a furious fit of laughter that she had to lean against the wall for support. But suddenly she jolted upright as if she had been shocked. We all looked at what had been the cause of her reaction. There on the wall, at about the same level as the bathtub, was a tiny door. None of us had noticed it because it was the same color as the walls. The landlord had even painted over it. Naturally, it made me a bit nervous. Whatever it was, the landlord clearly didn't want anyone opening it. But as usual, throwing all caution to the wind, Lindsay reached up for the handle and began tugging with all her might. Stephanie clucked her tongue in disapproval before pulling out a small pocket knife. She began delicately carving along the seam of the door. I wanted to beg her to stop, but I really didn't have the energy to argue that night. So within a few minutes, Lindsay had yanked the little door open with a loud crack. It was a crawl space. It was fairly large. My guess would have been that you could fit at least 3 or 4 people in there. I was rather curious as to why the landlord would have sealed up an empty little room. While I thought about this, Stephanie and Lindsay began calling for Alicia to come to see their new discovery. She was just as excited as they were when they first discovered it. However, as could be expected, this excitement waned over time, and eventually the crawl space was just turned into storage for a few towels and laundry baskets. In the following days, after the unsealing of the crawl space, things started to go from eerie to downright terrifying. Annoyingly, Alicia had changed her nightly routine so that I could no longer use her bathroom in the evenings. Once again, I was back in the large bathroom, all the while, the feeling that I was being watched growing worse and worse. I began to get so paranoid each time I went into that room that I could literally jump at the slightest noise of pipes settling. And as soon as I was finished, I would run at full speed down the hallway and close the door behind me. For some reason, I seemed to be the only one feeling this way. It's not like I could have told the other girls either. I was already enough of an outcast as it was, so I just kept it to myself and hoped it would go away eventually. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. One night as I was getting ready for bed, I found myself alone in the bathroom. As I stood in front of the mirror brushing my teeth, something set the hairs on the back of my neck straight up. There was a faint rustling noise, not the kind that could have been caused by my roommates at the other end of the flat. Any noises caused by them would have had to have been quite loud to reach me all the way at the end of the long hallway. No, this noise was very faint, the sound of someone gingerly shuffling things around. I stood completely silent, terror filling me. The soft rustling noises were coming from inside the crawl space. I turned on my heels and ran down the hallway to grab the attention of my roommates. I tried to explain to them that what had happened, but all that came out was incoherent murmurs. Eventually, I managed to stutter, Something's inside the crawl space. They looked at me with fear and confusion in their eyes. As a pack, we moved together down the hallway into the bathroom. I nearly fainted when I saw the tiny door hanging fully ajar. Though this discovery filled me with horror, Alicia immediately pointed to the balcony's sliding door. Stephanie had left it open to air out the bathroom after having taken a shower several hours earlier. She peeked her head in the door and pointed to the slanted rooftop adjacent to ours. There was a pigeon's nest occupied by a few birds. The girls surmised that a pigeon must have found its way in, and that was the cause of the disturbance. They had all had a good laugh as we made our way back to the living room. I pretended to shake it off, but I knew that it was not a pigeon that was causing the rustling noise. First off, the tiny door had been shut tight all day. None of us really cared to leave it open because it smelled quite musty inside. And secondly, the door had been shut when I left the bathroom. I am quite certain of this. There it was, open wide when I returned. You're not going to tell me that a pigeon knows how to and is capable of opening and closing a door all by itself. It was at this point that I began to suspect that something was terribly wrong with this apartment. When I got back to my room, I pulled out my laptop and I called my best friend via Skype. She'd always been the skeptical and methodical type. However, she also kept an open mind towards things that were hard to explain. I decided that out of anyone, she was probably the best to talk to about my situation. As I expected, she was initially quite doubtful, though she agreed with me that a pigeon was quite likely not the source. She asked me if I had any photos of the crawl space, and she said that if she could see it, that would help her to understand a little more clearly, and possibly help her to come up with a more logical explanation. Relieved at her willingness to at least hear me out, I reached for my camera and made my way back down the eerie hallway. When I arrived, I found, to my relief, that the door was still closed. I stood in front of it for a moment, gathering my nerve, before finally pulling open the little door. Despite the clutter left inside by my roommates, it was empty. I snapped a quick photo before closing the door once more and running back to my room. I immediately plugged my camera into my computer and uploaded the photo. When I finally uploaded the image, I was petrified by what I saw. There, in the upper right-hand corner, was a face baring its teeth at me. My whole body began violently shaking. "Dear God, that thing isn't my home," I muttered to myself. Fear began to overtake me. Someone had sealed whatever it was inside of that crawl space, and we had let it out. I was so absorbed in my panic that I didn't even notice when my roommate returned. She was so blissfully unaware of the imminent danger that we were in, yet even if I tried to warn her, she would not believe me. I was at a loss of what to do, and finally decided that I would deal with it in the morning. Though not by a large amount, I did feel braver in sunlight. From there, I attempted to get some sleep. Though for the first time ever since being there, I closed and bolted my door before getting into bed. Stephanie eyed me suspiciously while doing so, but I just told her jokingly that Lindsay had been sneaking into our room the previous nights and had been stealing my Nutella. She laughed heartily, shaking her head before settling down for the night. I will admit that the only reason I was able to find any sleep that night was because of her presence. Something about not being alone can give a false sense of security. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning when the sound woke me. I'd always been a light sleeper, so the faint noise was enough to stir me. It sounded like a door being pushed open at the other end of the flat, followed by footsteps. But these weren't just normal footsteps. They were far too fast. It sounded like someone was running at full speed from the foyer to the living room and all about the apartment. But these weren't heavy footfalls like the kind you would expect from a running person. They were light, almost unnaturally so. My initial reaction was to assume that it was either Alicia or Lindsay, so I got up and stuck my ear to the wall behind me that separated Lindsay's room from mine. I could hear the faint but steady breathing. She was clearly asleep. It wasn't her. Then I crossed over to the other side of my room, to the door, and once again stuck my ear to the wall. Alicia's snoring was quite audible, so there's no way it was her. I began to grow fearful as I turned to the last resort to see if Stephanie had perhaps gotten up. I could plainly see her resting form silently rising up and down. A shiver went down my spine, and I nearly screamed when I realized that the footsteps had come to a stop outside my door. Despite all the lights being out, I could clearly see the looming dark shadow of a form through the tiny crack at the bottom of the door. I dared not move. Whatever it was just standing there, waiting. Then, to my horror, the doorknob began to slowly jiggle. Gentle at first, but then growing violent at the realization of it being locked. The noise of it eventually woke my roommate. She sat up, blinking in confusion. That instant, the jiggling of the doorknob stopped. She asked me what the hell I was doing and if I knew what time it was. I told her it wasn't me. I told her that whatever had opened the door to the crawl space the previous day had come back. She just furrowed her brow at me and then said that I needed to get more sleep. The next day, I made an appointment with my program supervisor. I told him that I just needed to go home. He tried to tell me that I was just homesick and that it would pass, but I insisted. He eventually gave up and let me call my parents. They were confused but understanding. They were able to change the date of my return flight to the following morning. I really wanted to get out of there that day, but understandably, that was the soonest that they could manage. Unfortunately, this meant that I would have to stay one more night in the apartment. When I returned, I tried to tell the others about what had been going on. I knew I was going to be getting out of there and would be out of danger, but I was still immensely worried for their safety. But none of them took me seriously. They looked at me as if I was a madwoman. They didn't say anything, but I was sure that they all thought I was going home because of some sort of mental breakdown. At that point, there was nothing I could say that would convince them. So that night, I locked my door and hesitantly went to bed. And right on cue, once again around 2 o'clock in the morning, I was awoken by the rapid footsteps scampering around the apartment. I could hear the door to the bathroom begin to creak open, followed by a door at the end of the hallway. The footsteps grew louder and faster as they moved through the apartment, and finally, once more, they came to a pause outside of my door. I could hear breathing this time, slow and heavy. I sat up in panic, and to my horror, I saw that Stephanie had forgotten to lock the door behind her after getting up to use the restroom. It was right outside my door, and I did not know if I had time to jump up and try to lock it before the thing realized that there was nothing blocking its way. I hesitated a moment too long, and by the time I had sat up straight in my bed, the handle began to turn. I froze in terror as the door cracked open, revealing my tormentor. It stood there ominously in the doorway, staring me down, its eyes protruding slightly from its skull that gave off a very faint bluish light. It didn't appear to have a nose, only slits where the nostrils should have been. It had the teeth of a man, but no lips, giving it the impression of an eternally toothy snarl. Its grayish-white skin was waxy and stretched tight over its bony face. The rest of its skeletal form was hard to make out as it was almost entirely enveloped in shadows. After pausing for a moment in the doorway, it began to head toward me. As it moved, its body let out the sickening cracks, as I sat there, still petrified by fear, until it had made its way to the foot of my bed. Its heavy breaths were deafeningly loud. I don't know how Stephanie slept through it. The air had begun to smell sour and stagnant. With staggering speed, it jolted to the other end of the bed, mere feet from me. I gagged at the smell of it, like sulfur and rotting flesh. Slowly it unfurled one of its long, gnarly hands and proceeded to reach for me. Not until it was several inches away did I finally find my voice. I screamed as loud as I possibly could, and it halted in its tracks. Stephanie shot up from her bed, visibly frightened. The creature hunched over on all fours and fled the room with unsettling movements that recalled those of a spider. Moments later, Stephanie switched the light on and looked at me furiously. She demanded to know what all the fuss was about. I told her exactly what had happened, but she just called me a nutcase. The taxi came to pick me up very early the next morning. The sun had not even risen by the time it arrived. None of the girls came to see me off, but I expected this. After loading my luggage onto the truck, I climbed into the back seat of the old cab. It had driven right through the square and was sitting at the base of my apartment. When I leaned out to look out the window, I could see where my room had been. My face contorted to a mixture of panic and concern. There, looking out of my old window, was the creature. Its unblinking eyes bore into me, and its lipless mouth curled into a snarling grin. Before I could say anything, the cab driver had taken off, leaving the hell house far behind. I tried to warn them, I really did. I did everything in my power to try and warn them of the danger that they were in, but none of them listened to me. There was no way I could have stopped what happened after I returned home. You see, several weeks after returning to the United States, I received a phone call from the program director. He informed me that a day before the program ended, all 3 of my roommates had been reported missing. The authorities had no idea just how long they had actually been gone for, as they were only recently discovered to be missing when the program director went to check on them, and none of them made it to the end of the program wrap-up meeting. They assumed it had been at least a week or 2, since all of the food in the apartment had expired. There was no sign of forced entry, and no valuables were missing. The only notable detail mentioned in the report was that when they arrived on the scene, there was a strange little door hanging ajar in the bathroom, and when they approached it, they were met with a powerful odor coming from no visible source. The official report had declared them as missing, but I know that they're all dead. I know that I'm incredibly lucky to have made it out with my life. I think the only reason I'm still alive today is because I fled thousands of miles and across an ocean. Despite their unwillingness to listen, I still feel an unimaginable amount of guilt over what happened to those girls. That's why I'm writing this now. I may not be able to go back in time and save them, but maybe I can prevent this from happening to you. Please, please heed my warning. If you ever get the opportunity to study abroad, keep in mind, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. And whatever you do, don't stay on the 3rd floor of an ancient yellow apartment complex over the Campo di Fiori. There's something there, something evil.
Okay, my next story is by Saint Entropy 1, and it's titled, Grandma's Light is Always On. In one corner of my grandma's living room stood a lamp that was almost never turned off. She would change the bulb every week like clockwork, waiting until the afternoon sunlight poured through the windows and filled the room. Even then she hurried, holding her breath until the deed was done and the lamp was back on. I would ask her about it once in a while. Each time she would smile softly, tousle my hair, and promptly change the subject. I didn't learn the truth until I was 13, the first time I turned off the lamp. I just wanted to see what would happen. Grandma screamed when she walked into the darkened living room, a plate of cookies falling from her hands and crashing to the floor. I could hear her praying under her breath as she raced to turn the light back on. Tears were shining in her eyes when she turned to me, her lips pressed thin. Without warning, she slapped me hard across the face. Grandma had never so much as raised her voice before, and I was too shocked to cry. She cried enough for the both of us, gathering me up in her arms and begging for my forgiveness. With her face buried in my shoulders, she finally told me about the lamp. It was a ghost light, she said. Ever since she and my grandpa had bought the house, back when they first arrived in America, the spirits of the dead had plagued her. Only when her burden threatened to drive her mad did she ask Grandpa for help. She had expected him to laugh her out of the house, but he had surprised her by nodding gravely. It was he who had first lit the ghost light, and as long as that beacon burned through the darkness, she had never seen another spirit. I stopped visiting my grandma after that. It started gradually at first, missing a day here and there, but by the time I received news of her death, I hadn't seen her in over 10 years. As her only living relative, I shouldn't have been surprised when I inherited her house. Yet as I sat in her lawyer's office listening to him read her will, I was speechless. I had a difficult time paying attention after that, absorbed as I was with the business of remembering. So much love had filled those walls, so many happy memories. As I thought of my tiny, sterile apartment in the city, I quickly made my decision. I was almost overwhelmed by emotion as I walked through the front door. Everything looked exactly as I remembered it from my childhood. Houseplants still cluttered the windowsills, decorative bird plates still hung on the walls, and the ghost lights still burned in the living room. Seeing the old lamp sent a chill down my spine. I froze in my tracks, the smile fading from my lips, and I couldn't help but think of the night Grandma had slapped me so many years ago. I had told my mother about the ghost light the next day, but she had dismissed it as a simple old-world superstition. It was the same way when she was growing up, she told me, and I shouldn't worry about it. Still, I couldn't shake the conviction that I had finally seen the true depths of my grandma's lunacy. I ran my fingers through the fringe on the lampshade as I thought, a bloom of sadness darkening my nostalgia. Sighing heavily, I turned the ghost light off with a decisive click. Something woke me later that night. I lay in bed, listening to the darkness until I heard scratching coming from the living room. Rats were the last thing I wanted to deal with at the moment, and I rolled over with a groan, determined to ignore it until the morning. The scratching continued intermittently, constantly jerking me from the edge of sleep, and I finally had enough. I threw the blankets off me and stormed out into the hall. Moonlight flooded the front of the house, and I didn't bother turning on lights as I made my way to the living room. I knew every inch of the house, even after so many years, and I moved confidently through the dim light. I was furious at having been woken from a dead sleep, and my anger ill-prepared me for what I found. An elderly woman was crouched in the corner, her gaunt back to me. She was scratching at the floor where the walls met, stopping every few minutes to cock her head. A gnarl of dread unfurled in the pit of my stomach. I had no idea how this woman had gotten into my house, and though it was obvious she needed help, it took me some time to summon the courage to approach her. My hand shook as I reached out to gently squeeze her shoulder. I meant to ask her where she lived, who her caretaker was, but the words were driven from my mind when she turned and I saw her face. Her eyes were solid black, bottomless pits that didn't reflect the moonlight. Her jaw hung impossibly open, unhinged, and the dark tunnel of her mouth spiraled down into her throat. I had a moment to realize who she was, to recognize the familiar map of wrinkles in her face, the curls of her wispy hair. Then my grandma screamed. I shrieked, stumbling backwards away from the nightmare in the corner. My arms flailed in the air, reaching for the nearest lamp, and my hands touched the ghost light. I yanked the chain, filling the room with light, and she was gone. I never turned off the ghost light after that. After letting the bulb burn out one evening, I began changing it every week just as Grandma had. Eventually I got married, and luckily for me, my wife was tolerant of my strange fixation on the lamp. The light continued to burn, and I lived my life happily enough. But my grandson has been asking about the ghost light lately. Each time he asks, I smile softly, tousle his hair, and promptly change the subject. For some reason, I can't bring myself to tell him the truth. I think about how I pulled away from my grandma, how I thought her crazy, and I keep my mouth shut. I worry, though. I know I won't be around forever, just as I know he will eventually turn off the ghost light. I worry that he might see me then, twisted and wrong, scratching in the corner.
All right, my second one was from Creepypasta, and it's entitled, They're Not Coming, They're Already Here, written by Zach Hicks. They're not coming, they're already here. That's all the email said. No subject, no name, and the email account was clearly a junk or throwaway account linked to AOL Mail. At first, I laughed at the ridiculously serious message, not paying it much thought. I used to sign up for all sorts of stupid conspiracy/UFO magazines and online subscriptions when I was younger. I figured it was just spam mail trying to get people to go to their website or something like that. But then I remembered that there was no URL or link to anything, only those 6 ominous words. I remember thinking that it was some sort of marketing gimmick, that whoever was running that department was doing a terrible job. As I was finishing that thought, I heard my phone ding. It was another email from the same person. This time, all it said was, "Don't act any different or say anything. They will know." At this point, I began to feel a little creeped out. I still didn't know what the person was talking about, or if they even meant to send these cryptic messages to me at all. All I knew was that I was scared. I replied back, "I think you have the wrong person. Please don't email me again." Foolishly, I thought that would resolve the issue. It didn't. About 5 minutes later, I received another email with my full name, date of birth, and apartment number. At first, I thought that perhaps this was a cruel prank some friends of mine were playing on me, but even they wouldn't take a joke this far. Finally, I decided that enough was enough. I wasn't going to let some random person get under my skin like this, so I blocked the sender's email address. Surely, I thought, that would put a stop to all of this nonsense. But once again, I was wrong. I received another email from a different account. Same thing as before, no subject and no name, just another foreboding message. Whatever you do, don't look outside. As soon as I read the last word, I heard a loud pop outside of my apartment just as my power cut out. I thought the sound may have just been a generator or something, but then a blinding blue light began pulsating outside. As curious as I was about the source of the light and noise, I couldn't stop thinking about that last email. Whatever you do, don't look outside. Could this really be that great of a coincidence? Or did the person sending me these emails know something that I didn't? Either way, I was too afraid to look outside. The pulsating lights began to scan up and down my apartment building. I instinctually ducked under my window, afraid that whatever that light was might reveal my location. Then the light just disappeared. At that moment, the power came back on, so I stood up and slowly drew back my curtain. Nothing looked abnormal. The parking lot was as still and quiet as it is on most nights. I saw a man nonchalantly walking his dog as if nothing had just happened. I felt so silly for getting so worked up and scared over nothing. Then my phone dinged again. This time all it said was, "I told you not to look outside, now they know." At this point, I knew that someone had to be watching me. There was no other way to explain how they knew that I had disobeyed their previous message. I looked outside my window again and saw the same man with his dog, except they weren't walking anymore. They were standing still and looking straight up at my apartment, both with their mouths agape. I quickly closed my curtain and grabbed my phone. This was all too much for me. Without thinking, I dialed 911 and waited several minutes before an operator answered. 911, what's your emergency? I immediately began to try and explain every strange thing that had been going on for the last hour or so, from the emails and the strange blue light to the man and his dog. I suddenly realized that I sounded like a schizophrenic with all of my incoherent rambling. I just began to slow down and apologize to the operator when a piercing, high-pitched sound took over the call. The sound was so intense that I couldn't even leave the phone up to my ear. Just as I ended the call, another email popped up. There's no hope in resisting now, it read. You're just another one we've lost. I grabbed a duffel bag and began stuffing it with as many clothes and other items that it could hold. There was no way that I was going to stay holed up in my apartment for a second longer. I preferred to stay a few nights in a hotel, even if my car if necessary, until I had something more concrete figured out. I swung my front door open to find dozens of people surrounding the man and his dog, all of them staring right at me, mouths agape. I heard the same piercing noise as before, and it occurred to me that the sound was actually emitting from their open mouths. I started to make a run for my car when they all instantly threw their arms up, pointing at me while walking in my direction slowly. There were too many of them and my car was too far away. I sprinted back to my apartment and boarded up all of the doors and windows. It's been 3 days now. I still haven't left my apartment, and every time I try to call someone, I'm bombarded with the same high-pitched tone. I'm at a loss for what to do at this point. Giving up and submitting to them is the last thing that I want to do, but it's starting to feel like my only option. I'm not sure how much longer I have before they break me, but there's still hope for you. Whatever you do, don't look outside.
All right, this is called The Longest Hair by Brad Baya. I woke in the dark of night, scratching at the back of my head. I felt a strange bump there, and a hair protruding from it, oddly thick. My heart skipped a beat. I pinched the hair and slowly traced my fingers along it. It was long. On and on the hair went, past my shoulder, down to my waist, and off the bed out of reach. I sat up and clicked on the bedside lamp. My stomach sank as I looked across the bedroom. The thick strand of hair ran from the back of my head all the way down to the floor. It drew a black line across the room to the door, and beyond into the hallway. Suddenly terrified, I grabbed the hair at the root and pulled, trying to pluck it from my scalp. But I couldn't get it out, no matter how hard I yanked. I looked around for something sharp, scissors, a knife to cut the hair, but saw nothing within reach. There were scissors in the kitchen, I knew, but I was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't bear leaving the imagined safety of my covers. Instead, I grabbed the phone from my bedside table and unplugged the charger. But when I tried to turn the screen on, nothing happened. I pressed the button again and again and again, but the phone was dead. Keeping my eyes on the doorway where the dark hair slid under the slightly ajar door, I leaned toward the edge of the bed. I reached under the bedside table, feeling for the end of the phone charger. When my hand found the cord, I traced my fingers along it, just as I had done with the hair. But when I reached the end of the cable, I felt the frayed fibers of exposed wiring. Hot tears began pooling in my eyes then. As I brought the charger to my face in the dim light, I saw that it had been mangled. The torn end of the cord glistened in the lamplight, wet. The coarse strand of wires fanned out from the rubber coating. To my horror, I thought I could see teeth marks along it. That's when I heard it, a rustling sound coming from the hallway just beyond the bedroom door. A shiver washed down my arms and legs. I let the charger slide to the floor and held my breath, listening. A soft thud, then a dragging sound. I stared at the door, though it was only open enough to see a sliver of darkness. Thud. I clutched the blanket, my heart pounding in my chest. Again, the back of my head began to itch. The hair on the floor seemed to quiver. My eyes darted from the door to the hair, and I reached to feel the lump on the back of my head. Across the room, the hair began to lift, sliding up against the doorframe, as if something in the hallway was pulling it taut. Tears broke over the edge of my eyelids and ran down my face. Slowly, the hair was pulled tighter across the room until it lifted off my shoulder and pulled gently at my head. I saw a flicker of movement in the crack between the door and the frame. My breath caught as I stared into the darkness. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I saw it, just barely visible, the wet glisten of an eye watching me from the doorway. I tried to shout, but only a weak rasp came from my throat. I grabbed the hair with both hands and tried to pull it away from my scalp with all my strength. It stayed firmly attached. When I began to scramble away from the doorway, the hair pulled tighter, and then the room spun, and I was on the floor, dragging along the carpet, yelling and kicking. In a flurry of blankets, I kicked the bedside table, and the lamp came crashing down. And the last thing I saw as the light bulb burst into darkness was the gaping mouth and wet eyes rushing toward my face. This time, when I woke to a nagging itch at the back of my head, a bright morning light filled the room. My head was swimming, my skin felt raw, and for a brief moment I had no idea where I was. When I realized I was on the floor of my bedroom, memories of the night came flooding back. I sat up too quickly, steadying myself on an elbow while the room spun in a flash of dizziness. Surely it was a dream. I blinked and looked around me. The bedroom door was wide open, and I was sprawled in the doorway. Blankets and pillows lay scattered around the room. On the floor beside the bed sat the toppled lamp and the mangled charger. No. I lifted a hand slowly to the back of my head. When I touched the skin, it was shockingly tender. A lump and what felt like a dried scab, but no hair. No hair! The realization dawned on me. Anywhere on my head. Only rough, scabbed skin that stung at the touch. I staggered to my feet and rushed to the bathroom, flicked on the light, and looked in the mirror. I barely recognized the reflection staring back at me, horror in its eyes. Where there was once a full head of hair, now was only red, lumpy flesh. Among the scabs and fresh cuts that covered my head, I saw them clear as day. Teeth marks. I was treated for the wounds and given bandages. Shortly after that night, I broke my lease and moved to a new apartment. My hair is finally starting to grow in again. When I tell my story, most people act shocked and concerned, but I know they don't believe me. I haven't had a good night's sleep since. When I'm lying in bed, I could swear I hear a rustling outside my door. I think it's waiting for the hair to grow.
All right, my last story is called This New Old House by Bat Out of Hell 821. We bought an old house, my boyfriend and I. He is in charge of the new construction, converting the kitchen into the master bedroom, for instance, while I'm on wallpaper removal duty. The previous owner papered every wall and ceiling. Removing it is brutal, but oddly satisfying. The best feeling is getting a long peel, similar to your skin when you're peeling from a sunburn. I don't know about you, but I kind of make a game of peeling, on the hunt for the longest piece before it rips. Under a corner section of paper in every room is a person's name and date. Curiosity got the best of me one night when I Googled one of the names and discovered the person was actually a missing person. The missing date matching the date under the wallpaper. The next day I made a list of all the names and dates. Sure enough, each name was for a missing person with dates to match. We notified the police, who naturally sent out the crime scene team. I overheard one text say,
"Yup, it's human."
"Human? What's human?"
"Ma'am, where is the material you removed from the walls already? This isn't wallpaper you were removing."
That was so gross.
Makes me feel like summer's it makes me glad that summer's almost over. We won't have any more sunburns to remind us of that story.
I was like, what part of that makes you think of summertime?
Well, also summer's the worst, so scary story.
Yeah,
scary
but then
season.
But in winter we have dry skin, so
That's true. That's true.
All right, this is the last one. This is by No Hope, No Sleep. Why you shouldn't leave your kids alone around mirrors. My mom had expensive taste, so as soon as I was too old for a crib, my parents outfitted my room with grand and ornate furniture. It might seem out of place for a kid at that age to have mahogany dressers and a king-sized bed, but it's really not strange at all if you knew my parents. They always treated me like an adult. Even my name, Alana, had seemed too big for me at that age. Part of my new and exquisite bedroom set was a massive vanity mirror. It was one of those things that was so decadent it bordered on gross. My parents hung the mirror on a wall opposite my bed, and it gave me the creeps. I hated it, but no matter how much I complained, my parents refused to take it down, lest it ruined the decorum of the room. I couldn't even sleep with this mirror staring at me. The night terrors came so frequently, my dad eventually found a compromise and hung a sheet over it every night with thumbtacks. This helped me fall asleep, but I still felt uneasy in my own room, especially since the thumbtacks seemed unable to hold up the sheets for the whole night. Sometime after I would fall asleep, the curtain fell to the floor, leaving the mirror to stare at me while I slept. One night, when I laid awake, too scared to fall asleep, I saw the curtain move. A ripple formed under the curtain, like it was being disturbed by some invisible wind. I pulled my covers up over my eyes and tried counting back from 10. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. Suddenly I realized how silly I was being. I was 12 years old by now. I was too grown up to be afraid of a silly mirror. So I pulled back the covers and took a peek. I'll never forget what I saw that night. My breath caught in my throat. A craggy hand with long, pale fingers reached out from beneath the curtain and was pulling on the thumbtack. I threw the covers back over my head and waited for the bad thing to go away. Seconds passed like hours. I began to believe that the monster had left me alone, but the sound of the sheet hitting the floor echoed across the room. There was a lull, and then I heard the breathing. It sounded like it was above me, on the other side of my blanket. I stayed awake, listening to the heavy breaths, until dawn started to filter through the windows and the breathing stopped. My head peeked out from beneath my covers again, and the monster was nowhere to be found. I never had a close call like that again. My parents found me smashing the mirror with my bare hands while screaming something about the man in the mirror. I'm way older now, so I should have outgrown this ridiculous fear, but I still got nervous when my husband hung a mirror up in our daughter's room. This one was a lot smaller and less gaudy than the one I had when I was her age. My daughter didn't seem to be afraid of the mirror at all. To the contrary, she'd lay the mirror on the floor and play pretend with her dolls, Penny and Sally. It was Saturday night, the end of laundry day. While I was headed to the dryer, I walked past her room and overheard something that stopped me in my tracks.
"Can Mommy and Daddy come into the mirror too?"
My daughter whispered. My heart was pounding in my chest as I leaned into her room trying to get a glimpse at what she was doing. All the nightmares and memories from my childhood came back to me in a flood. Penny and Sally were lying discarded on the mirror, and my daughter's hands were placed face down on top of it. Her beautiful tawny hair dangled below her, just barely touching the glossy surface. I thought I saw something reaching up from the mirror, hidden behind her hair. "Who are you talking to, sweetie?" I called out. My daughter jerked her hands up off the mirror like she'd been caught doing something she wasn't supposed to.
"Nobody, Mom. I was just playing with my friends."
"Okay, well, I think it's probably time for bed. Let's put the mirror up and get you in your pajamas." She fussed like usual, but we got the mirror back up and I tucked her into her bed. I tried to shake off the whole experience. It was probably just my stupid, overactive imagination. Later that night, I woke up in a cold sweat. There was this feeling that something in the house was just wrong. I slipped on my house shoes and made my way to my daughter's room as quickly and quietly as I could, trying not to wake anyone up so I didn't have to explain what I was doing. When I reached my daughter's door, my panic was nearly overwhelming. I could practically hear that awful, heavy breathing like I was hiding underneath my covers once again. My hands pushed the door open and I let loose a horrible scream. My daughter was lying in bed, fast asleep, but a pale white hand was wrapped around her throat. The thing was looking up at me after my scream. I wish I had never seen its face. 2 maggot-ridden holes peered back at me where its eyes should be. Toothy jaws split all the way up its elongated face. Filthy wrappings like bandages loosely wrapped around its crooked back tried to cover its rotted body. The thing smiled wickedly. I think it remembered me. Then it gripped my daughter's throat so hard she woke up. Her eyes bulged and she clawed at the hand, but it was no use. My legs scrambled to bring me to my daughter, but before I could reach her, the beast leapt through the mirror. My daughter went in with him. The force of them passing through knocked the mirror off the wall, and it shattered into a million pieces on the floor. By now, my husband had gotten out of bed and came into the room. "What is it? What happened?" he cried. I didn't respond. I was hunched over the mirror trying to piece it together again in some futile attempt to go in after my daughter. My hands were cut and bleeding, but I worked furiously to piece it together. Something was moving behind the glass, but the image was all scattered and disjointed. I could have sworn my daughter's light auburn hair flickered across the glass. Then the image was gone. My husband pulled me away from the fragmented glass. Things between us were never the same after that. We eventually had to separate. The loss of our daughter was too painful for either of us to even look at each other anymore. Now I sit alone in my house, surrounded by mirrors. Every night I lie awake, hoping the monster in the mirror will come back and take me too, so that I could see my daughter even just one last time.
All right. Well, we hope you enjoyed those scary stories. We know this is a little bit different episode. We tried to be solemn and foreboding.
Yes, not as much banter, more trying to scare you.
Yeah. So, good luck sleeping.
Good luck sleeping.